Picture this. It's 1807, and you're standing in the parlor of a respectable Philadelphia home. The morning light filters through clean windows onto polished furniture. A gentleman adjusts his freshly starched collar, checks his reflection in a proper mirror, and prepares for his weekly bath. This is civilization. This is what America looked like east of the Missouri River. Now, and here's where it gets interesting, some of these same gentlemen are about to abandon everything their mothers taught them about cleanliness and walk into a world that will literally strip them naked. I'm talking about the mountain men, and when I say strip them naked, I mean that both figuratively and, as you'll see, sometimes quite literally. The fur trade was calling, you see. Beaver pelts were worth their weight in silver back east, and beyond the Missouri River, those beavers were just sitting there, waiting. But here's the thing that gets me about this moment in history. These men had absolutely no idea what they were signing up for. They thought they were going on an extended camping trip. They had no concept that they were about to become something entirely different. Something, well, let's call it less than civilized. Take John Colter. Now, Colter had been with Lewis and Clark, so he wasn't completely green. But even he couldn't have predicted what happened to him in 1808. Picture this scene, and I want you to really visualize this, because it's almost too bizarre to believe. Colter is trapping with a partner near the Three Forks of the Missouri when they run into a Blackfoot war party. We're talking about maybe 500 warriors here. 500. His partner gets killed immediately, but the Blackfoot, and this is where it gets surreal, they decide to have some fun with Colter. They strip him completely naked. Not just his clothes, they take everything. His boots, his hat, even his undergarments. Then they give him about a 300-yard head start and tell him to run. 300 yards against 500 mounted warriors in Montana wilderness, naked. Now, here's where the hygiene part becomes crucial, and this is something that would never occur to a gentleman back in Philadelphia. Colter had been in the mountains for months at this point, months without a proper bath. His skin was dark with dirt and bear grease. His hair was matted with who knows what. And that unwashed, unkempt appearance, that savage look that would have horrified his mother, that's what saved his life. Think about it. He's running naked through prairie grass and brush. A clean, pale body would have stood out like a beacon, but Colter's dirt-caked skin blended with the earth. The bear grease that civilized people would have found revolting acted like natural camouflage. When he dove into a beaver pond and hid under a pile of driftwood, he didn't just look like part of the wilderness, he smelled like it too. The parter, yet firster, Inder. Blackfoot searched for him all day. They walked right past his hiding spot multiple times. Why? Because this Philadelphia gentleman had become something else entirely. Something that belonged to the wilderness. But that's just one man, one incredible escape. What I find fascinating is how this transformation was happening to dozens, then hundreds of men all along the frontier, and it wasn't happening by choice, at least not at first. Let me tell you about Hugh Glass. Now, Glass was tough. You might know him from the bear attack story, but before he became a legend, he was just another man trying to figure out how to survive in a world that had very different rules about personal hygiene. Glass learned something that would have shocked his mother back east. Soap could get you killed. I'm not exaggerating here. The scent of soap, especially the lavender and rose-scented varieties that gentlemen used back east, acted like a dinner bell for bears. Grizzly bears, it turns out, are intensely curious about unusual scents. A man who smelled like Philadelphia was a man asking for trouble. So Glass, like the others, started using bear grease instead. Now, imagine trying to explain this to your refined Eastern relatives. Well, mother, instead of washing with soap, I rub myself down with rendered bear fat. The horrified expression alone would have been worth the price of admission. But here's the thing, it worked. Bear grease didn't just repel mosquitoes and black flies, which could drive a man insane during summer months. It also provided a protective layer against wind and cold. And most importantly, it made you smell like something that belonged in bear country rather than something that needed investigating. The psychological transformation was just as dramatic as the physical one. These men had to completely rewire their understanding of what it meant to be clean, what it meant to be civilized, what it meant to be human. Back east, cleanliness was literally next to godliness. A dirty man was a moral failure. Personal hygiene was tied directly to social standing, to respectability, to your very worth as a human being. But in the mountains, those rules didn't just not apply, they were actively dangerous. A mountain man who tried to maintain Eastern hygiene standards was a dead mountain man. Period. So, they adapted. They had to. And in adapting, they created something entirely new in American culture, a code of masculinity based not on social convention but on survival efficiency. Consider what this meant on a daily level. Back east, a gentleman would wake up, wash his face and hands in a basin of clean water, shave with a sharp razor and soap, brush his teeth, comb his hair, and put on fresh undergarments. Every single morning. This wasn't just routine, it was identity. But in the mountains, clean water might be frozen solid for months at a time. A sharp razor was far too valuable to risk dulling on facial hair when it might be needed, to skin a beaver or defend your life. Fresh undergarments. The concept became almost laughable. Some mountain men wore the same set of buckskins for years at a time. And you know what? They discovered it worked better. Those buckskins, seasoned with sweat and smoke and animal grease, became more flexible and water-resistant over time. They molded to the body in ways that store-bought clothing never could. They provided insulation that fresh, clean clothes couldn't match. What civilization called filthy, the wilderness called practical. But perhaps the most profound change was social. Back east, you could tell a man's station in life by his appearance. Clean clothes, well-groomed hair, the scent of quality soap, these were the markers of success and respectability. In mountain man society, those markers got completely flipped. The cleanest man at a gathering was probably the greenest. The one who still smelled like civilization was the one who hadn't learned the rules yet. The most successful trappers, the ones who commanded respect and could guide you safely through hostile territory, were often the ones who looked and smelled like they'd been buried and dug up. This wasn't just a change in hygiene habits. This was a complete revolution in how American men could define themselves. For the first time in our history, we had a class of men whose very survival depended on rejecting everything polite society said they should be. Think about the courage that required. These weren't rebels or outcasts to begin with. Many of them came from respectable families. They had mothers who loved them, communities that expected certain things from them. But they chose, or were forced by circumstances to choose, a path that made them aliens to their own culture. And here's what really gets me about this moment in history. They were just getting started. What happened to men like Coulter and Glass in 1807 and 1808 was just the beginning. The real transformation, the creation of a completely new kind of American man, was still to come. Because surviving your first encounter with wilderness hygiene realities, that was just the entrance exam. Learning to thrive in that world, to master it, to become something that civilization couldn't even recognize anymore, that was going to take years of trial and error, innovation and adaptation. And some of them weren't going to make it, but the ones who did, the ones who figured out how to turn the wilderness from an enemy into an ally, they were about to face something that would test every assumption they'd learned to abandon. Because their first winter was coming, and winter in the Rocky Mountains doesn't care how tough you think you've become. Winter was about to show these transformed gentlemen that they hadn't even begun to understand what survival really meant. Winter in the Rocky Mountains doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your plans, your supplies, or your previous experience. And for the mountain men facing their first real winter in 1808, it was about to become the most brutal teacher they'd ever encountered. Now, if you think the hygiene challenges were tough during the warmer months, winter cranked everything up to 11. We're talking about temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Minus 40. At that temperature, your spit freezes before it hits the ground. Your breath creates ice crystals that can cut your lungs. And taking a bath, that's not just uncomfortable anymore, it's a death sentence. Jim Bridger learned this lesson the hard way. Bridger was young then, maybe 17 years old, and he still had some civilized notions about keeping clean. The story goes that early in his first winter, he tried to wash his shirt in a mountain stream. Seemed reasonable enough. The shirt was getting pretty rank, even by mountain man standards. Here's what happened. The wet shirt froze, solid on his body, before he could get back to the fire. Solid, like a sheet of ice molded to his chest. His companions had to literally chip the ice away from his skin with knives, and Bridger came dangerously close to losing fingers and toes to frostbite in the process. But here's the thing that's absolutely fascinating. Bridger's dirty backup shirt, the one he'd been avoiding because it was so filthy, actually kept him warmer. The accumulated grime and body oils had created a kind of natural insulation. What his mother would have called disgusting was actually superior winter survival gear. This was the moment, and you can pinpoint it almost exactly, when mountain men stopped thinking like civilized people and started thinking like the environment itself. Jedediah Smith figured out another piece of the puzzle around the same time. Smith was more religious than most mountain men, more inclined to maintain some connection to civilized behavior, but even he had to adapt when he discovered that soap and winter were a potentially lethal combination. See, Smith tried to treat a minor cut on his hand with soap and hot water, the way any civilized person would. But soap, it turns out, strips away the natural oils that protect your skin from extreme cold. Within hours, that small cut had become a gaping wound. The soap had removed the protective barrier that his skin had built up over months of mountain living. In minus 20-degree weather, that clean wound became infected almost immediately. Smith nearly lost the hand. He probably would have, except for something that happened next that changed everything for the mountain men. His Crow Indian wife saved him. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting, because this is where two completely different hygiene philosophies collided, and one of them proved dramatically superior. The Crow had been living in this environment for centuries. They'd figured out how to stay healthy and clean in conditions that killed unprepared white men. But their methods would have horrified any civilized person back east. Smith's wife treated his infected wound not with soap and bandages, but with sage smoke and bear grease. She made him sit in a small enclosed shelter while she burned sage bundles, letting the smoke penetrate every pore of his skin. Then she packed the wound with a mixture of bear grease and powdered willow bark. It worked. Not only did it worked better than anything Smith had ever seen. The infection cleared up in days instead of weeks. His skin, instead of cracking and bleeding in the cold, became supple and protected. And the sage smoke? It didn't just clean his wound. It seemed to clean his entire respiratory system, clearing out months of accumulated smoke and dust from campfires and trail dust. This was a revelation. The Crow weren't just surviving the winter, they were thriving in it. And their hygiene practices, which looked primitive and savage to European eyes, were actually sophisticated adaptations to environmental reality. Word spread through the mountain man community like wildfire. Here was a way to stay clean that actually worked in winter conditions. Not clean by Philadelphia standards, but clean by mountain standards, not per set, which meant healthy, protected, and alive. Soon, mountain men throughout the Rockies were building their own sage smoke lodges. They were learning to read the signs of different illnesses in each other's scent. They were discovering that the Crow practice of seasonal cleansing, 9 deep cleaning, only at specific times of year when conditions were right, made infinitely more sense than the daily washing routine they'd grown up with. But winter had more lessons to teach, and not all of them came with Native American solutions. The winter of 1809 was particularly brutal. Temperatures dropped so low that trees exploded from the cold. Game disappeared entirely for weeks at a time, and in the hastily constructed winter camps scattered throughout the mountains, men started dying from diseases that clean water and proper sanitation might have prevented. Dysentery hit first. Now, dysentery is bad enough under the best circumstances, but imagine dealing with it when the nearest water source is a frozen stream that you have to break with an axe. When going outside, to relieve yourself means exposing your body to potentially fatal cold. When there's no way to properly clean yourself afterward, because soap would freeze your skin and water would turn to ice before you could use it. The traditional response to dysentery, AM, lots of clean water, frequent washing, clean clothing, wasn't just impractical in these conditions, it was impossible. So the mountain men had to innovate. They learned to manage the disease using snow packed against fevered skin. They discovered that certain tree barks, chewed and swallowed, could help control the symptoms. They figured out how to maintain basic sanitation in sub-zero conditions, using techniques that would have seemed bizarre to civilized observers, but that actually worked. Old Bill Williams came up with what might have been the most important innovation of all. Williams was an odd character, even by mountain man standards, OY, part preacher, part madman, completely adapted to wilderness life. During that brutal winter, he developed a system for what he called winter washing that kept his group healthier than anyone else's. Instead of trying to wash with water, Williams used snow, but not just any snow. He was particular about it. Fresh snow, packed against the skin for just long enough to remove surface dirt and oils, but not long enough to cause frostbite. Then he'd rub down with pine pitch and animal fat. The combination removed harmful bacteria and parasites while creating a protective barrier against the cold. It sounds crazy, right, washing with snow? But Williams's men had the lowest disease rates of any group that winter. They also had fewer problems with lice, fleas, and other parasites that plagued other camps. The psychological impact of that first winter can't be overstated. These men weren't just learning new hygiene techniques. They were discovering that everything they'd been taught about cleanliness, health, and proper living was not just wrong, but potentially deadly in this environment. Think about what that does to a person's worldview. Everything your mother taught you, everything your community expected, everything that marked you as civilized and decent, all of it not just irrelevant, but dangerous. Some men couldn't handle it. They tried to maintain civilized standards despite the conditions, and they paid for it with frostbite, infection, and sometimes death. Others went too far in the opposite direction, abandoning all standards of cleanliness and health, and they also paid a price in disease and social isolation. But the ones who found the balance, who learned to adapt, without losing their essential humanity, they emerged from that first winter as something entirely new in American culture. They'd become men who could look at a mountain stream in January and know instantly whether the ice was safe to break for water. Who could diagnose illness in a companion by scent alone? Who could construct shelter and maintain health in conditions that would kill most civilized people within days? By spring of 1810, the surviving mountain men had been through what you might call a complete cultural rebirth. They'd been stripped down to absolute essentials and rebuilt according to wilderness rules. Their hygiene practices weren't just different from civilized norms, they were superior for the environment they lived in. But here's what's really remarkable. They were just getting started. That first winter had been about survival, about learning the basic rules. The years to come would be about mastery, about taking those hard-won lessons and turning them into a sophisticated system that would allow them not just to survive, but to thrive in ways that would amaze their contemporaries. Because the mountain men were about to enter their golden age, and in that golden age they would perfect a form of wilderness hygiene so effective, so perfectly adapted to their environment, that it would become the foundation for everything else they accomplished. They were about to become masters of their domain, and that mastery would be built, in large part, on their revolutionary understanding of what it really meant to be clean. By 1815, something extraordinary had happened in the American wilderness. The surviving mountain men had moved beyond mere adaptation. They had achieved mastery, and nowhere was this mastery more evident than in their revolutionary approach to personal hygiene. These weren't the desperate, half-civilized refugees who had stumbled into the mountains 8 years earlier. These were specialists, experts, men who had turned wilderness survival into an art form, and hygiene practices were at the very center of that art. Kit Carson exemplified this new breed of mountain man. Carson had developed what other trappers called his pine needle technique, and watching him perform it was like watching a master craftsman at work. Every morning, Carson would locate a specific type of pine tree, not just any pine, but one with the right needle density and oil content. He'd strip off his buckskins and literally roll his entire body through fresh fallen needles, covering himself from head to toe. Now, to a civilized observer, this would have looked like the behavior of a madman. A grown man, naked, rolling around in pine needles like some kind of forest animal. But Carson's technique was based on sophisticated understanding of wilderness biochemistry. Those pine needles contained natural oils that repelled insects more effectively than any manufactured product. They also had mild antiseptic properties that prevented skin infections, and the physical action of rolling through the needles provided a kind of full-body scrub that removed dead skin and parasites while stimulating circulation. Carson could emerge from his pine needle bath cleaner and healthier than many civilized men after their weekly soap and water routine. But the real genius was seasonal. Carson adjusted his technique based on the time of year, the local ecosystem, even the specific challenges he was facing. In mosquito season, he'd target pine varieties with higher oil content. During winter, he'd mix in sage for its warming properties. If he was traveling through tick-infested areas, he'd add certain types of bark that ticks found repulsive. This wasn't primitive behavior. This was sophisticated environmental science being practiced by someone who couldn't read or write, but who understood forest ecology better than most university-trained naturalists. Old Bill Williams took a completely different approach, but one that was equally masterful. Williams had become fascinated with what he called medicinal stinks. He'd discovered that different types of body odor could actually indicate and sometimes prevent different types of illness. Williams could diagnose everything from dietary deficiencies to early-stage infections just by smell. A companion developing scurvy would start smelling slightly sweet 2 weeks before other symptoms appeared. Someone fighting off a respiratory infection would develop a distinctive musty odor that experienced mountain men learned to recognize immediately. But Williams went further than diagnosis. He learned prevention. He'd deliberately cultivate certain types of bacteria on his skin by rubbing himself with specific plant materials. To civilized observers, Williams smelled absolutely horrible, but his self-induced stench was actually a carefully balanced ecosystem of beneficial bacteria that crowded out harmful microorganisms. Williams hadn't been sick a day in over 10 years, not one day. In an environment where dysentery, typhoid, and respiratory infections regularly killed healthy men, Williams had achieved functional immunity through the deliberate manipulation of his body's bacterial environment. The social dynamics of mountain man hygiene were equally sophisticated. By 1820, a complex hierarchy had developed around cleanliness, BAT, but it was the complete opposite of civilized social structures. At summer rendezvous gatherings, you could identify the most experienced and successful trappers by their smell before you could see them. The greenhorns, the men new to mountain life, still tried to maintain some semblance of civilized cleanliness. They'd show up at rendezvous having attempted to wash their clothes, maybe even having shaved. They stood out like sore thumbs, and experienced mountain men would actually avoid doing business with them. Why? Because a man who still worried about conventional cleanliness was a man who hadn't learned the mountains yet. He was unreliable, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous to travel with. His hygiene choices advertised his inexperience to anyone with the knowledge to read the signs. On the other hand, the most successful trappers had achieved what you might call optimal filth. They weren't just dirty, they were dirty in very specific, purposeful ways that indicated deep understanding of wilderness survival. Their clothing was stained and odorous in patterns that told stories about successful hunts, dangerous encounters, and seasonal adaptations. Jim Beckworth was a master of this kind of social signaling. Beckworth had lived with the Crow for several years and had learned to combine Native American hygiene practices with mountain man innovations in ways that made him incredibly effective in both worlds. Beckworth could walk into a Crow village smelling exactly right to be accepted as a member of the tribe. He could adjust his scent profile to communicate different things, whether he was coming in peace, whether he had goods to trade, whether he was seeking shelter or just passing through. And he could do the same thing with White Mountain men, using scent and appearance to establish his credibility and experience level immediately. This wasn't deception. This was sophisticated social communication using a language that civilized people couldn't even perceive, much less understand. The medical knowledge that mountain men developed around hygiene was genuinely revolutionary. They'd learned to treat wounds using methods that were often more effective than contemporary medical practice. A mountain man treating a knife cut would clean it not with soap and water, but with honey mixed with pine resin. The honey provided antibacterial protection, while the pine resin sealed the wound against infection. This combination actually promoted faster healing than conventional medical treatment for serious injuries. They developed poultices using combinations of plants, animal products, and minerals that could prevent infection and speed recovery in ways that amazed the few educated doctors who encountered their methods. Dr. Marcus Whitman, who traveled with mountain men in the 1830s, wrote that their wound treatment techniques were primitive in appearance but superior in result to anything he'd learned in medical school. The seasonal rhythms of mountain man hygiene were particularly sophisticated. These men had learned to read the calendar in their own bodies, adjusting their hygiene practices to match environmental conditions and biological needs. Spring was intensive cleaning season. After months of winter accumulation, mountain men would engage in ritualistic deep cleaning that removed not just surface dirt, but also dead skin, parasites, and the bacterial buildup of winter survival. This wasn't a quick wash. It was a multi-day process involving steam baths, herbal treatments, and sometimes complete replacement of clothing and equipment. Summer was maintenance season. Daily hygiene practices focused on parasite control, heat management, and protection from insects and sun exposure. The techniques were subtle and specific. Different oils for different types of bugs, different cleaning methods for different types of terrain. Fall was preparation season. Hygiene practices shifted to building up protective layers for winter. This meant deliberately cultivating beneficial bacteria, building up skin oils, and adjusting diet to change body chemistry in ways that would provide winter protection. Winter was survival season. Hygiene became purely functional. just enough cleaning to prevent disease, but not so much as to remove protective barriers against the cold. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of mountain man hygiene mastery was their ability to teach and transmit this knowledge. By 1825, experienced mountain men had developed sophisticated training systems for newcomers. A greenhorn traveling with an experienced trapper would receive what amounted to a graduate education in wilderness hygiene. This wasn't casual instruction, it was systematic knowledge transfer that could mean the difference between life and death. New mountain men learned not just what to do, but why to do it, when to do it, and how to adapt techniques to different circumstances. The psychological transformation was complete. These men had moved beyond rejecting civilized hygiene standards, die entirely. They'd created something entirely new and superior. They'd proven that human beings could adapt to extreme environments, not by fighting against natural conditions, but by learning to work with them. And they were about to put this mastery to the ultimate test. Because the peak years were coming, the period when mountain man hygiene expertise would become the foundation for economic empire, political power, and westward expansion on a scale that would reshape the entire continent, their mastery of the unwashed arts was about to become the key to mastering everything else. Between 1820 and 1840, mountain man hygiene expertise became the foundation of American westward expansion. This wasn't just about staying clean anymore. This was about power, wealth, and the creation of economic empires that would reshape the continent. Think about this for a moment. The United States government was trying to map and control territory that stretched from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. We're talking about millions of square miles of unmapped wilderness, hostile tribes, and environmental conditions that could kill armies of unprepared men. How do you govern territory you can't even safely travel through? The answer was mountain men, and their hygiene expertise was absolutely central to their value. Jim Beckwourth understood this better than anyone. Beckwourth had spent years perfecting his ability to blend seamlessly into Crow society, and a huge part of that was his mastery of scent and appearance. When he walked into a Crow village, he didn't just look like he belonged, he smelled like he belonged. His body odor told a story about where he'd been, what he'd eaten, and how he lived that the Crow could read like a book. This made Beckwourth incredibly valuable to American fur companies and government expeditions. He could negotiate treaties, establish trading relationships, and gather intelligence in ways that conventional diplomats couldn't even attempt. And it was all based on his revolutionary understanding of hygiene as communication. But Beckwourth went further than anyone else. He actually became a Crow chief, not an honorary title, but genuine leadership position with real authority over tribal decisions. How did he do it? Partly through his hygiene practices. The Crow had elaborate purification rituals that mark transitions in social status. Beckwourth learned to perform these rituals so authentically that he could literally transform his social identity through hygiene practices. He could smell like a war leader when he needed to project authority, or like a peace negotiator when he needed to diffuse tensions. His body became a diplomatic tool. Joe Meek took a different but equally effective approach. Meek figured out that his legendary stench could actually be a political asset. When Oregon Territory was being organized in the 1840s, Meek deliberately cultivated the most outrageous appearance possible. His hair was matted with years of accumulated grease and debris. His buckskins were so saturated with animal oils and human sweat that they'd become waterproof. His smell was so powerful that people remembered him years after a single encounter. This wasn't accident. This was calculated political theatre. Meek understood that territorial politicians and Eastern investors had romantic notions about frontier authenticity. They wanted to meet a real mountain man, someone who embodied everything wild and free about the American West. Meek gave them exactly what they expected, and he parlayed that image into real political influence. Meek became Oregon's territorial representative to Congress. Think about that. A man who hadn't bathed in years was representing American interests in the halls of government, and he was effective at it, precisely because his hygiene practices authenticated his credentials as someone who really understood frontier conditions. The 1836 rendezvous at Green River was the peak of mountain man culture, and hygiene played a central role in everything that happened there. 800 mountain men gathered in the largest unwashed assembly in American history. The collective body odor was reportedly visible as a haze over the valley, and that's not an exaggeration. That many men who hadn't bathed in months, all gathered in one place, created an atmospheric, a phenomenon. But here's what's fascinating. That gathering became the economic and political center of the American West for several weeks. Government officials, military commanders, business investors, and tribal leaders all came to Green River because that's where decisions were being made about the future of the continent. And they had to negotiate not just with mountain man leaders, but with mountain man smell. The hygiene practices that mountain men had developed for survival had become markers of expertise and authority. When a military expedition needed guides through hostile territory, they specifically sought out the dirtiest, most unkempt mountain men they could find. Clean men were presumed to be inexperienced. Smelly men were presumed to know what they were doing. This created a genuine revolution in American social hierarchies. For the first time in our history, filth was a marker of competence rather than moral failure. Bad hygiene indicated valuable skills rather than personal deficiency. The dirtier you were, the more people wanted to hire you. Mountain men leveraged this into serious money. An experienced trapper who could guide a wagon train safely through Indian territory might earn more in a single season than a skilled craftsman could make in 5 years back east. And their fees were often justified specifically by their hygiene-indicated expertise. Military commanders would pay premium rates for guides who looked and smelled like they'd been living in the wilderness for years. Government surveyors would seek out the most unkempt mountain men available, because their appearance guaranteed that they understood frontier conditions. Trading companies would compete for the services of men whose personal hygiene would have gotten them arrested for vagrancy in civilized areas. The medical knowledge that mountain men had developed around hygiene became equally valuable. When cholera outbreaks hit westward moving wagon trains, conventional medical practice was often useless or actually harmful. Doctors trained in Eastern medical schools would prescribe treatments that worked fine in Philadelphia, but could be deadly in wilderness conditions. Mountain men, however, had developed cholera treatments based on their understanding of wilderness hygiene that were dramatically more effective. They knew which plants could control symptoms, how to maintain hydration using methods that didn't require large quantities of clean water, and how to prevent the spread of disease in close quarters without conventional sanitation infrastructure. Wagon train leaders quickly learned to defer to mountain man medical expertise, even when it contradicted the advice of university-trained physicians. The mountain men's understanding of disease prevention and treatment, developed through their revolutionary hygiene practices, often meant the difference between a successful crossing and a trail of graves. But perhaps the most important impact was on American expansion itself. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the size of the United States, but most of that territory was unmappable and ungovernable using conventional methods. Mountain men, with their hygiene-based survival expertise, were the only Americans who could reliably operate in those conditions. They became the advance guard of American expansion. They mapped the routes, established relationships with tribes, identified resources, and proved that Americans could not just survive but thrive in environments that had previously been considered impossible for white settlement. And their hygiene practices were central to all of this. Their ability to blend with natural environments, to communicate through scent and appearance, to maintain health in extreme conditions, these skills made them invaluable intermediaries between American civilization and Western wilderness. The economic impact was enormous. The fur trade that mountain men dominated was worth millions of dollars annually. But more importantly, their exploration and mapping activities made possible the territorial expansion that would define American identity for the next century. Oregon Territory, California, the Southwest, all of these became American not through military conquest, but through the gradual penetration of mountain men whose hygiene expertise allowed them to operate where conventional Americans couldn't survive. By 1840, mountain man hygiene practices had become the foundation for American control over territory stretching from coast to coast. Their unwashed bodies had built an empire, but empires built on such unconventional foundations are inherently unstable, and change was coming. Change that would challenge everything the mountain men had learned about the relationship between cleanliness, competence, and social value. The collision between mountain man culture and advancing civilization was about to begin, and hygiene would be the primary battlefield. The 1840s brought a crisis that no amount of wilderness expertise could solve. American civilization was expanding westward faster than anyone had anticipated, and it was bringing with it a completely different set of values about cleanliness, respectability, and what it meant to be a proper American. For the first time since they'd entered the wilderness, mountain men found their hygiene practices under direct attack, not from hostile tribes or dangerous wildlife, but from their own countrymen. The collision began with the Mormon migration to Utah. Now, the Mormons were tough people. They had to be, to undertake that kind of journey, but they were also deeply committed to cleanliness as a moral virtue. When Mormon wagon trains encountered mountain men offering guide services, the cultural shock was immediate and profound. Brigham Young himself described meeting a group of mountain men in 1847 as encountering the very demons of filth. These were men Young needed. They knew the routes, the water sources, the safe passages through hostile territory. But their appearance and smell were so offensive to Mormon sensibilities that Young initially refused their services. Here's what happened. A Mormon woman named Eliza Snow wrote in her diary about seeing mountain men for the first time. They approached our camp like apparitions from a nightmare. Their hair hung in matted ropes. Their clothing was so saturated with grease and dirt that it moved like armor. But most horrible was the smell, a combination of rancid fat, unwashed humanity, and something indefinably wild that made my stomach revolt. But here's the thing that makes this collision so tragic. The mountain men weren't trying to be offensive. They were following hygiene practices that had kept them alive for decades. That rancid fat Eliza Snow smelled was bear grease that protected their skin from sun, wind, and insects. Those matted ropes of hair were deliberately styled to shed water and provide insulation. That indefinably wild smell was the scent of men who had achieved perfect adaptation to their environment. To the Mormons, these men looked like moral failures. To the mountain men, the Mormons looked like people who didn't understand the first thing about survival. The California gold rush made everything worse. Starting in 1848, thousands of fortune seekers poured westward, and many of them hired mountain men as guides. But these gold rushers brought with them middle-class expectations about cleanliness and respectability that were completely incompatible with mountain man culture. Kit Carson, by then one of the most famous mountain men in America, found himself in increasingly awkward situations. Gold rush parties would hire him specifically because of his reputation, but then demand that he clean up his appearance before entering settlements. Carson was caught between two worlds. His expertise was valued, but his authentic appearance was rejected. The psychological impact on mountain men was devastating. These were men who had spent decades developing hygiene practices that were perfectly adapted to frontier conditions. They'd created a culture where filth was competence, where smell was communication, where their bodies themselves were tools finely tuned for survival. Now they were being told that everything they'd learned was wrong, that their life-saving practices were evidence of moral corruption, that their expertise was valuable but their authenticity was shameful. Some mountain men tried to adapt. Joe Meek attempted to clean up his act when he became Oregon's territorial representative, but the results were almost comical. Meek had worn the same set of buckskins for so long that they'd essentially become part of his body. When he finally tried to remove them for washing, he discovered that the leather had grown into his skin in several places. The cleaning process left him with infections and rashes that took months to heal. More tragically, Meek's cleaned-up appearance actually undermined his political effectiveness. Eastern politicians had hired him specifically because he looked like an authentic frontiersman. When he showed up in Washington wearing store-bought clothes and smelling like soap, he lost the very authenticity that had made him valuable. Jedediah Smith faced a different but equally painful challenge. Smith had always been more religious than most mountain men, and he'd maintained some connection to civilized values throughout his wilderness years. When he tried to return to respectable society in the 1840s, he discovered that his body had adapted so completely to wilderness hygiene practices that conventional cleanliness was physically painful. Smith's skin had become dependent on the protective oils and beneficial bacteria that he'd cultivated through years of mountain man hygiene practices. When he tried to wash with soap and wear clean clothes, his skin broke out in painful rashes. His respiratory system, adapted to the purifying smoke of sage ceremonies, couldn't handle the confined air of civilized buildings. His digestive system, adjusted to the seasonal cleansing rituals of mountain life, was disrupted by the constant availability of refined foods. Smith was literally allergic to civilization. His body rejected everything that respectable society demanded. But perhaps the most heartbreaking casualties were the mountain men who tried to explain their practices to civilized audiences. Jim Bridger, for example, was frequently called upon to lecture to geographic societies and military academies about wilderness survival. He'd attempt to explain the sophisticated reasoning behind mountain man hygiene practices, but his audiences heard only barbarism. When Bridger explained that bear grease was superior to soap for preventing infection, his listeners heard advocacy for filth. When he described the complex seasonal rhythms of mountain man cleansing practices, they heard elaborate justifications for laziness. When he demonstrated the diagnostic power of reading health and illness through scent, they saw a man who had lost touch with basic human decency. The rejection wasn't just social, it was economic. By the 1850s, wagon trains were increasingly likely to hire guides who looked respectable rather than guides who smelled authentic. Military expeditions were under pressure to employ scouts who wouldn't embarrass the service in front of civilian observers. Trading companies wanted representatives who could interact with Eastern investors without causing offense. Mountain men found themselves forced to choose between effectiveness and acceptability. They could maintain the hygiene practices that kept them alive and competent, or they could adopt the appearance standards that kept them employable, but they couldn't do both. Some mountain men retreated deeper into the wilderness, choosing authenticity over acceptance. Others attempted painful transformations, trading their hard-won survival expertise for social respectability. Many ended up caught between worlds, too civilized for the wilderness but too wild for civilization. The psychological damage was enormous. These were men who had spent decades proving that human beings could adapt to extreme environments, that intelligence and innovation could overcome any challenge. They'd created a culture based on practical wisdom rather than social convention. They demonstrated that there were alternative ways to be American, alternative definitions of cleanliness and respectability. Now they were being told that none of that mattered, that practical wisdom was worthless if it didn't conform to social expectations, that innovation and adaptation were meaningless if they produced results that polite society found offensive. The mountain men had won against grizzly bears, hostile tribes, brutal weather, and every challenge the wilderness could throw at them. But they were losing to soap salesmen and social conformity. The collision at the wash basin wasn't just about hygiene, it was about what kind of country America was going to become. Would it be a place that valued practical competence over social convention? Would it celebrate innovation and adaptation, even when those qualities produced results that challenged comfortable assumptions? The mountain men were about to find out. And for most of them, the answer would be devastating. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 wasn't just a triumph of engineering, it was a death sentence for mountain man culture. When those rails connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, they didn't just transport goods and passengers, they transported a vision of America that had no place for men who built empires on practical wisdom and bear grease. Kit Carson saw it coming before most. By the 1860s, Carson was in his 50s, his body worn down by decades of wilderness living. But the real damage wasn't physical, it was cultural. The government that had once paid premium rates for his services was now embarrassed by his appearance. Military commanders who had once deferred to his expertise now worried about how he'd look in newspaper photographs. Carson made a desperate attempt to transform himself. He bought store-bought clothes, submitted to regular barber visits, and tried to learn the hygiene routines that respectable society demanded. The results were heartbreaking. Carson's body rebelled against conventional cleanliness with almost violent intensity. His skin, conditioned by decades of bear grease and sage smoke, broke out in painful rashes when exposed to soap and clean fabric. His hair, cut short and styled in civilized fashion, no longer provided the protection he'd grown dependent on. Most tragically, his legendary ability to read environmental conditions through smell was severely compromised by the perfumes and scented soaps that respectable society required. Within months, Carson had lost much of the expertise that had made him valuable. His transformation into a respectable citizen had destroyed the very skills that justified his existence in the new American order. Jim Bridger faced an even more humiliating decline. Bridger had been called the greatest scout who ever lived by military commanders who depended on his wilderness expertise. But by the 1870s, those same commanders were under pressure to employ guides who wouldn't offend the sensibilities of newspaper correspondents and Eastern investors. Bridger attempted to adapt by creating what he called civilized mountain man services, wilderness guiding with improved hygiene standards. He'd wash before meeting clients, wear cleaned buckskins instead of authentic ones, and modify his appearance to seem less threatening to refined sensibilities. But the modifications undermined his effectiveness. Clients hired Bridger because they wanted authentic frontier expertise, but they also wanted him to look respectable. The contradiction was impossible to resolve. Bridger's cleaned-up appearance made him seem less credible to people who expected their wilderness guides to look wild, while his residual wildness made him seem unacceptable to people who expected their employees to look civilized. Bridger ended up satisfying no one. He'd lost his authenticity without gaining respectability, sacrificed his effectiveness without achieving acceptance. The tragedy wasn't just individual, it was cultural. America was losing something irreplaceable. The mountain men had developed the most sophisticated wilderness survival knowledge in human history. They'd created hygiene practices that were perfectly adapted to extreme environments. They'd proven that human beings could thrive in conditions that conventional wisdom considered impossible. And all of that knowledge was being dismissed as primitive barbarism by people who couldn't survive a week in the conditions where mountain men had lived for decades. Joe Meek's final years illustrated the broader tragedy. Meek had parlayed his mountain man credentials into political success, but he'd never been able to bridge the gap between frontier authenticity and civilized expectations. By the 1870s, his legendary stench had become a liability rather than an asset. Oregon Territory wanted respectable representation, not colorful characters. Meek spent his last years trying to write down the wisdom he'd accumulated through decades of wilderness living. He wanted to preserve the hygiene practices, the medical knowledge, the environmental expertise that mountain men had developed. But he discovered that civilized audiences weren't interested in learning from people they considered failures. Publishers rejected his manuscripts as unsuitable for respectable readers. Medical journals refused his articles on wilderness health practices as unscientific. Military academies declined his offers to teach survival techniques as inappropriate for officer training. The knowledge that had built an empire was being allowed to die, with the men who'd created it. Hugh Glass, the legendary survivor of the Grizzly attack, spent his final years as a cautionary tale rather than a hero. The same survival expertise that had made him famous in the 1820s made him unemployable in the 1870s. His appearance frightened children, his smell offended adults, and his hygiene practices were viewed as evidence of mental deficiency. Glass ended up in a territorial poorhouse, his medical bills paid by charity because no one would hire a man who looked and smelled like he'd been living in the wilderness for decades. The irony was devastating. Glass's wilderness hygiene practices had kept him healthier than most men his age, but his appearance made him seem like a health hazard to people who'd never spent a day outside civilization. The psychological destruction was perhaps the worst part. These weren't men who'd failed to adapt. They were men who'd adapted so successfully to their environment that they couldn't readapt to a different one. Their hygiene practices weren't primitive. They were sophisticated responses to specific environmental challenges. Their appearance wasn't evidence of moral failure. It was evidence of practical wisdom. But none of that mattered to a society that valued conformity over competence, appearance over accomplishment. Old Bill Williams died alone in 1849, but his death illustrated the broader cultural tragedy. Williams had been the most innovative mountain man hygienist, the man who developed medicinal stinks that prevented disease more effectively than contemporary medical practice. His knowledge could have revolutionized public health, wilderness medicine, and environmental science. Instead, Williams died in poverty and obscurity because his appearance and smell made him unemployable in respectable society. His revolutionary understanding of human adaptation to extreme environments died with him, dismissed as the ravings of a filthy old man. The final indignity came when historians began writing the official version of Western expansion. Mountain men were portrayed as colorful characters rather than serious innovators. Their hygiene practices were described as amusing eccentricities rather than sophisticated adaptations. Their expertise was reduced to folklore rather than recognized as genuine scientific achievement. The men who had actually built the foundation for American expansion were written out of the story in favor of sanitized heroes who looked more acceptable to middle-class sensibilities. By 1880, the last of the great mountain men were gone. With them died the most sophisticated understanding of wilderness hygiene in human history. America had chosen cleanliness over competence, respectability over innovation, social conformity over practical wisdom. But the mountain men had proven something that couldn't be completely erased. They demonstrated that human beings could adapt to any environment, that intelligence and innovation could overcome any challenge, that there were alternative ways to define cleanliness, health, and human worth. That legacy would survive, even if the men who created it didn't. And in the years to come, America would rediscover some of what it had lost when it chose soap over survival wisdom. The mountain men were gone, but their revolutionary understanding of hygiene and human adaptation didn't die with them. It went underground, survived in unexpected places, and eventually resurfaced in ways that would reshape American thinking about cleanliness, health, and the relationship between human beings and their environment. The first place mountain man hygiene wisdom found new life was in the military. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898. American forces discovered that conventional hygiene practices were completely inadequate for tropical conditions. Soldiers following standard military cleanliness protocols were dying from diseases that mountain men had learned to prevent decades earlier. Military medical officers, desperate for solutions, began consulting the few surviving mountain men and studying their techniques. They discovered that the primitive practices they dismissed were actually sophisticated adaptations to environmental challenges that conventional medicine couldn't handle. The sage smoke treatments that mountain men had learned from Native Americans proved more effective against tropical parasites than any manufactured medicine. The bear grease applications that civilized society had found disgusting turned out to provide superior protection against insect-borne diseases. The seasonal cleansing cycles that had seemed barbaric to Eastern sensibilities were actually optimized for maintaining health in challenging environments. Military survival training began incorporating mountain man techniques, though they were rarely credited as such. The innovations were presented as modern scientific discoveries, rather than adaptations of knowledge that had been dismissed as backward superstition. World War I accelerated the process. Trench warfare created conditions that were remarkably similar to mountain man: winter camps, close quarters, limited water, extreme environmental stress, and the constant threat of disease. Conventional hygiene practices were not just impractical in those conditions, they were impossible. Military medical officers rediscovered mountain man innovations like snow washing, protective oil applications, and diagnostic techniques based on scent and appearance. Soldiers who adopted these techniques had significantly lower rates of infection and disease than those who tried to maintain conventional cleanliness standards. But the real revolution came in World War II, when military survival training finally acknowledged what mountain men had proven a century earlier: that adaptation was more important than conformity, that practical wisdom trumped social convention, and that human beings could thrive in any environment if they were willing to abandon preconceived notions about proper behavior. The Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, developed training programs that were essentially graduate courses in mountain man hygiene techniques. Agents learned to use natural materials for cleaning and protection, to read health and illness through scent, to adapt their appearance for camouflage and social blending. These weren't just survival skills, they were spy skills. The mountain men's understanding of hygiene as communication, as social signaling, as a tool for blending into different cultural environments, became central to intelligence operations around the world. The outdoor recreation industry that emerged after World War II was built almost entirely on mountain man innovations, though few people realized it. Backpacking, wilderness camping, rock climbing, and other outdoor activities required hygiene practices that were fundamentally different from civilized norms. The first outdoor gear companies were founded by veterans who'd learned wilderness hygiene techniques in military survival training. They created products designed around mountain man principles: natural materials, environmental adaptation, practical function over aesthetic appeal. Coleman camping equipment, Eddie Bauer outdoor clothing, REI cooperative gear. All of these companies built their business models on equipment designed to enable the kind of wilderness living that mountain men had mastered. They just marketed it to middle-class Americans as recreation rather than survival. The environmental movement of the 1960s rediscovered mountain man wisdom about the relationship between human health and natural systems. Suddenly, the idea that human beings should adapt to their environment rather than trying to control it seemed revolutionary rather than primitive. Environmental scientists began studying traditional ecological knowledge, including the hygiene practices of mountain men and Native Americans. They discovered that these backward techniques were often more effective and environmentally sustainable than modern alternatives. The sage smoke treatments that had horrified civilized observers in the 1800s turned out to be sophisticated applications of natural antiseptics that didn't disrupt environmental balance. The bear grease applications that had seemed disgusting were actually examples of sustainable resource use that modern chemistry couldn't improve upon. Mountain man's seasonal cleansing cycles, dismissed as laziness by Victorian moralists, were revealed to be optimized for human biological rhythms and environmental conditions in ways that daily washing routines weren't. Modern wilderness medicine has essentially become a rediscovery of mountain man hygiene innovations. Emergency medical technicians learn to treat wounds using honey and tree resins, just like mountain men did. Wilderness first aid courses teach students to diagnose illness through scent and appearance, using techniques that mountain men had perfected. Military medics use snow for cleaning and cooling, natural materials for protection and camouflage, and seasonal adaptation techniques that would have been instantly recognizable to Kit Carson or Jim Bridger. The irony is overwhelming. The hygiene practices that civilized society found so offensive that it drove mountain men into poverty and obscurity have become the foundation for modern outdoor recreation, military survival training, environmental science, and wilderness medicine. But perhaps the most important legacy is philosophical. The mountain men proved that human beings, they don't have to accept the limitations that conventional wisdom imposes. They demonstrated that adaptation and innovation can overcome any environmental challenge. They showed that practical wisdom is more valuable than social conformity. Their understanding of hygiene wasn't just about staying clean, it was about staying human in conditions that challenged every assumption about what human life could be. They proved that cleanliness isn't about following rules, it's about staying healthy and functional in whatever environment you find yourself. That lesson resonates far beyond wilderness survival. In every field where human beings face extreme challenges, medicine, science, exploration, even business, the mountain man approach of adaptation over conformity, practical wisdom over conventional thinking, remains relevant. The mountain men were defeated by soap salesmen and social pressure, but their ideas survived because they were based on truth rather than convention. They understood something fundamental about human nature, an environmental adaptation that civilized society forgot but couldn't completely destroy. Today, when hikers use natural insect repellents, when soldiers employ scent masking techniques, when environmental scientists study traditional ecological knowledge, when anyone chooses function over fashion in challenging conditions, they're following in the footsteps of men who were once dismissed as failures, but who actually understood something essential about what it means to be human. The mountain men lost the battle for respectability, but they won the war for practical wisdom. Their legacy is written in every person who values competence over appearance, adaptation over conformity, survival over style. They proved that true cleanliness isn't about following social rules. It's about staying alive, staying healthy, and staying human in whatever conditions life presents. That wisdom will never go out of style, no matter how much soap civilization produces. The great unwashed were washed away by history, but their understanding of what really matters endures. In a world that increasingly values authenticity over appearance, practical wisdom over social conformity, and environmental adaptation over technological domination, the mountain men's legacy becomes more relevant every day. They were the first Americans to prove that human beings don't have to accept the limitations that society imposes. They showed that with intelligence, innovation, and the courage to abandon conventional thinking, people can thrive in any environment. That's a lesson worth staying dirty for.